Hello, everybody. My name is Myster E, and welcome to episode 30 of the Revolutionary Think Tank podcast. For those of you joining us for the first time, this is a podcast about political commentary, protest music, and revolutionary thinking. And this is my co-host, 4AS. 4AS, how are you going today?
Yeah, I'm going pretty well. How about yourself, Mr. A?
I am very well, thank you, 4AS. I'm glad you asked. We've got a very interesting topic today.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think it is rather intriguing, conceptualizing how to integrate First Nations people, Indigenous cultures into established or existing political systems that are probably far removed from traditional practices,
Hmm.
and then trying to get what is called in this system a voice to Parliament. Is that right?
Yes, yes, very much so. And I'll at least preface this talk with the idea that the voice to Parliament or the referendum that's going to be happening later this year, which is quite a simple question. It's a binary question of yes or no of do the Australian people want to implement into the Constitution a voice to Parliament?
Hmm.
Very simple. But the point of implementing the voice to Parliament is that it's basically this overarching plan that uh, the Australian government have that all of the Indigenous mobs that are all around Australia and the Torres Strait of implementing a three-stage plan of voice, treaty, truth. Because the voice is basically establishing the framework of how the Indigenous community can basically communicate with government. And if they have any concerns, there is that kind of framework that's there.
Yep.
Once that happens, you can move on to treaty, which I think is pretty self-explanatory. So
Hmm.
all the different mobs that are all around Australia and the Torres Strait, they can
Yep.
actually, much like their counterparts, the Maori in New Zealand, they can actually establish proper treaties with the Australian government and
Hmm.
the sovereignty in this country, and then truth, which is well, is probably a bit more vague at this stage, but it's reestablishing their culture. I guess kind of improving on such things as native title and at least getting their self-determination back, which
Okay,
I,
so I think it's important then to establish in Australia
yes,
the Indigenous population, they have no treaty, they have no what rights. So you're saying they're integrated into the general population. They'd never had established any type of political what is it, determination of their own, some political autonomy or sovereignty of their own in their own country. Is that
you
right?
do raise a good point. We should probably start at the start because
Yeah.
obviously we have international viewers. So what people need to understand is, okay, obviously we're at the stage where Indigenous people, can vote in our elections and they are recognized as citizens. But if you go all the way back to 1788, when, you know, the first settlers, Governor Phillip, and basically the first fleet from England came to Australia,
Yep.
they came here and they established terra nullius. So they established this law that nobody lives here, even though they did see that there was native populations. They
Yeah.
basically just took the land and they just acted like, well, they seemingly don't have laws that are similar to England. Therefore, we're just not going to recognize that.
Mm.
And they established terra nullius, and
Which is a
look,
nice overarching idea that there's no one that has any claim to the land.
yeah, pretty much.
So it's
And
free for any taker, and that was the British at that time.
yes, and to just broad strokes of Australian Australian Indigenous history. Obviously, there was like thousands and thousands of mobs that were like all the different cultures that were across Australia.
Yep.
They basically got wiped out because of not only picking fights with the first settlers, but also they weren't used to the diseases that the first settlers were bringing in.
Mm.
Um, we get to the stage of the stolen generations where
Mm.
these basically the children of these indigenous communities, they were put on reservations and they were separated from their parents. Um, uh, Basically, to a long story short,
Yep.
the indigenous community was very heavily separated from its cultures, its traditions, and
Yep.
there's been a slow walk back within reestablishing those communities in
Yep.
Australian society, and
And recognizing them.
yes, pretty much. And back in the 2000s, there obviously was Sorry Day, and
Yep.
back in I think it was Golf Whitlam's time, the establish of native title with the giving the indigenous communities like land back to them if they were basically sacred lands to them.
Yep.
And through I guess you'd say the last 40 or 50 years, there's been this slow walk back, and the voice to parliament, it's at least the first gesture of in order for them to establish their self-determination, and Australia kind of recognizing that
Yeah.
this voice to parliament is supposed to be the first step towards that, because
Right. But it
really,
seems like it's a
yeah.
long kind of development since some of those milestones that you were discussing earlier in the 70s and then the 80s and the lead up to the 2000s and all that sort of stuff. It's quite a development from there and a signature of that whole progression up until this certain point. So it's potentially quite groundbreaking then
Yes.
this idea of the voice to parliament.
Yes, because like there's two things that I want to say before we kind of deep dive this a bit, is that one, the reason why this is really important is, well, kind of before this was established, or at least this idea was established, Australian governments previously were kind of just throwing money at the indigenous community and their problems, and nothing really happened. But that kind of makes sense because they weren't necessarily consulting the communities. They were kind of a bit like, oh, there's certain problems with X and there's certain problems with Y. Let's just establish our own committees and just throw money at the problem, and hopefully we can fix that. But
Right,
that
right.
didn't quite work. And then two,
So they didn't have like consultation with the people that were actually
well,
having things or policies or decisions made for them. And
Well,
so,
I wouldn't say that there wasn't consultation. I would say that there wasn't the right consultation.
yeah, okay.
Like I'd imagine, just look, I can't say that I know this history fully, but I'd imagine the fact that we've gotten to this point with
Mm,
the voice, before that uh, like I don't think having just one or a couple of representatives is really
mm,
going to be really going to help the community, or maybe just having a couple of representatives when all of these different mobs have different concerns and different
yeah,
issues.
yeah.
Like it's uh don't get me wrong. I'm pretty sure this is definitely for the Maoris, but they at least had like established connections with all of the different Maori groups that were in New Zealand. Whereas it's not necessarily the same case with the Australian mobs,
Mm,
because they were like very much separate from each other. Like obviously they did occasionally interact with each other, but Australia is its own continent. It's a vast uh
Yeah, yeah,
it's a vast surface area, so
yeah,
it's understandable that as far as the mobs in New South Wales were concerned, the ones in Western Australia were far away from them, so they didn't have active
mm.
interactions.
There's
So
they're very, very diverse and
mm,
fragmented compared to our neighbours over the other
yes.
side of the Tasman.
Yes,
Yes.
and I guess the second point is that, well, one of the main reasons the voice has come to where it is right now is because of the Uluru Statement of the Heart. So all of these elders came together. I want to say that it was in 2016. They basically, like, the gesture was they came to Uluru, which, if, for those of you who don't know, Uluru is, the famous sand mountain that you see in a lot of Australian postcards in the Northern Territory. They all congregated on the sacred area around there, and they drafted up this massive document of the basically all the different mobs coming together and agreeing that they need to collectively do something about Indigenous issues, and to collectively come together along with the Australian government and establish their self-determination.
Yeah, yeah.
And that eventually led to the process of the voice.
Okay, so
And
what is a voice then? What is a national voice? What is a voice to Parliament in essence? So it's just a committee or a group of representatives that then provide like an advisory role, like an advisory panel to the Parliament? Because like from what I understand of advisory panels or committees or anything like that is
mm,
they provide advice. So they might make a recommendation, but like there's nothing there in terms of having to carry out someone's recommendations or advice. It's like kind of written on the record and, it's just business as usual after that. So tell me where I've got that wrong before I ask.
well, look, you are right in the sense of what. So let's start with probably the head honchos that are going to be part of the voice to Parliament. So the national voice. So these are, you can probably see it in the graph there. And I'll make sure to provide it for you so you can show it to the people.
Yeah, show
You
it to the
obviously,
people.
yeah, you can obviously see that there's local and regional voices, and they're strongly connected to the national voice. So the national voice are basically elected members and elders of this voice process that, it's basically like a pre-selection where from the local community groups or local members that are basically take part in the local and regional voice process.
Mm,
Um, they are the ones that go to Canberra, and if there's any overarching Indigenous issues, yeah, they're actually sitting down with the politicians and they're giving advice. So yes, it is going to be an advisory uh, like an advisory board, and it's not going to be a third arm of parliament as some people confusedly thought it was going to be. It's basically just an advisory to the Australian Parliament and the Australian government. What
mm,
I think is also important is that it's actually from that national voice that do the overarching stuff. So if there's policy X that is 100% going to influence all of the different mobs in Australia, they are the ones that are basically steering the ship of that committee and all of that. Um, this has a lot of similarities of what I was what we've talked about previously
yeah.
with with how labor structures itself, with at least my experience. is that the local and regional voices, um, at least in my research, they actually, yeah, like I was saying before, they're the community groups, they're the members that kind of want to be involved in this process, where what they do is if there's any sort of local issues or regional issues, because that's the thing, there's going to be a local voice that's in an urban area. There's going to be um, a voice committee, if you will, in a regional area, and they will, I guess, pass issues. They'll be passing motions that are related to that issue, and that would actually go to what they call the partnership table, and it would eventually go to um, any sort of indigenous concerns that affect the local, the state, or the federal government. So if there's a specific one to the area, that's where the local and the regional stuff comes in. If there's a national concern, that's where the national voice comes in. But that's also the thing, like it's a two-way communication where the local and regional and the national voice are basically talking to each other, but they want to be a well-oiled machine by consulting the indigenous communities. And if it's a local concern, they can, like, the local and regional voices can go straight to the partnership table. But if there's a national concern, um, that basically can get hashed out in Canberra. In
Okay, and like so the important thing to realize here, as opposed to I guess just any other type of advisory panel or committee that provides some type of recommendations to parliamentarians and politicians,
Yes,
is that this is a constitutional change we're talking about here.
yes,
This is affecting the Australian Constitution, which is huge.
yes,
Like you don't
and
have constitutional changes of this magnitude coming about like really ever.
well, yeah. There's basically two reasons for that. One is, well, really, the federal government, so Albo and his government, they could actually go in the direction of what the Victorian Labor government is doing and also the South Australian Labor government are doing, and basically just establish a piece of legislation, pass it through the two houses, and there you go. You don't have to do you don't have to do a referendum.
But like you can
But
repeal legislation.
exactly. That's where I was going in the direction of. If for whatever reason another
Yeah.
government, a much more conservative government, came in, they could repeal that legislation, and the
Mm.
indigenous communities would be left out of the cold. Like
But you
all of
can't
this.
change the constitution unless you have a referendum? Is that what you're saying?
Correct. So but that's also the thing, is that changing the constitutional referendums are always seen as like a fairly hard thing to achieve, because
They don't
uh
normally get up, do they, for us?
well, yes, that is correct. To be honest, sometimes that's for the best, because I can tell you, for example, the recent one that happened, the referendum of for Australia establishing itself as a republic. If I remember correctly, around that time, John Howard and the Conservatives that were in that time, they basically had put the question, and also all of the details that were surrounding it, it was going to put a lot of power in the politicians' hands. So
Yeah. Yeah.
that probably wouldn't have been good for the Australian people, even
Right.
though I personally feel like,
Republic's the
becoming,
way to go.
yeah, well, I wouldn't
Yeah.
mind that.
Yeah, why
Um,
not? Because
I-
Australia is, for all of those that don't know, it, I think it's
yes,
pretty obvious. Most foreigners
yeah.
do comment on this. Australia is a constitutional monarchy.
Yes.
So it has ties in its constitution quite significantly, actually, if you
Mm.
pick up the document and read it. Like
Yes.
every second line almost is about, paying homage back to whatever king or queen is in power at
Yes.
the time. And you can't turn a corner really without some type of consultation, hence why you have a governor general and all these other types of
Yes.
institutionalized checks and balances on
Yes.
Australia's own sovereignty. But
Yes.
yeah, like having something like a voice to parliament,
Yes.
a national voice, or even having these local and regional voices institutionalize or constitutionalize, like put in the
Yes.
document that like guides the way that the entire country operates is that's immense. That's a huge call because, like you said, it just can't be taken away and repealed very easily. But
Well,
it
yeah.
changes the fabric of the nation, especially like essentially.
Well, yes, because really, that was the second point I was going to make is that yes, like once like if this were to be successful and people decide to change the constitution in order to establish the voice to parliament as part of our constitution, this sort of framework where you have the indigenous communities basically having um, a direct line to all the different parliaments, and there being an established framework of being an advisory committee, that's something that the indigenous communities didn't have before.
Yeah,
And like
yeah,
like I was saying before Australian governments were basically throwing money at the problem, and they effectively were not consulting the indigenous communities.
yeah.
So it's a good start.
Yes, yes, very interesting, and hence why it's so controversial, right? Because there is a lot of what's the word? I don't like saying misinformation, but like let's just say that there's a lot of, I guess, oh, how about this? There's a lot of scare out there that's happening within from certain media organizations,
Mm,
and certain public figures that are kind of, trying to dilute the conversation or throw people off because they might
yeah.
not see this as something that they want. So yeah, there's a lot of, I guess, yeah, confusion. People are, like you said, thinking, oh my God, this is going to change and there's going to be another, Parliament House or something like that, or
Yeah,
another
yeah.
arm to the whole process. And like, naturally people, they don't like change, like kind of
Yes.
thing. And so like they're adverse to it unless like they've got it all mapped out in front of them. Because that's the thing, the devil's like is usually in the detail when it comes to this sort of stuff, and it's not really figured out. Like they haven't mocked up a draft constitution or anything like that. They haven't really figured out the mechanics of this to the fine detail. Is that right for us, from what you know,
Uh,
or they have
well,
gone to that
look,
level?
I haven't fully read all of the
Mm,
300 uh, page report, because there actually is a final report where they have
yeah.
all of the detail in there. That's why
Okay.
that's
Okay.
why it's super hilarious when the opposition leader Peter Dutton came out and said, "Oh, there's no detail anywhere." It's completely hilarious that he came out and said that,
Yeah.
because even like some of his uh, basically some people in his party were actually part of this consultation process with the
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
of the Uluru State, the Heart. So for him to say that he had no idea about the detail and to
Mm.
flatly say that there is no detail, like it has to be a lie.
Yeah.
because
Well, it's just politics, isn't it?
well, yes, but I think more to your point of like probably there being like scare tactics behind this, or people
Mm.
afraid of that it's going to be massive change. Unfortunately, that's that's the name of the game of these sort of referendums, is that
Mm.
once you have a binary choice, people have to be either in this camp or this camp,
Yeah.
and it's just the nature of the game that you know whoever wants to be in the yes camp or the no camp, there's going to be argy bargy in
Mm.
that's perspective. But I'd like to think that this this is quite well thought out. That really what we're talking about here is an advisory group of basically issues that hadn't been really properly consulted up until this point. And
Mm.
this is also a really important point to emphasize with this.
Mm.
This isn't Albo going off and doing his own thing. Um,
Yeah.
this the Uluru Statement of the Heart, this voice to Parliament, like they actually had elders in the process that they were consulting. Like this is stuff that the Indigenous communities, the mobs all around Australia, want because really, if the goal for them is self-determination, you need to give the framework in order for them to have the first step.
Right.
And as far as the Uluru Statement of the Heart and all of those elders that were involved in that, all the way back in Uluru in 2016 to now, like they saw this as their step forward. So
Mm.
this has all been framed as, look, this isn't Labor going off and doing its own thing. They've just listened to the community, they've used their two ears and listened to what they wanted,
Yep.
and we're just being allowed to walk along with them.
Right, right. And so like I think it's important to kind of hone in on this idea of a step here.
Hmm.
So like, if this is step number one, what's two and three effectively? What comes after a national voice for IS?
Well, this is also the really important stuff that I guess I was kind of mentioning before. That's when treaty comes into it, and this is also
So what's that?
okay. So treaty would be if there were any sort of local concerns for all the different mobs, they'd actually be able to establish like a direct communication with the parliament that I guess kind of recognizes their mob and their way of of conducting their life and kind
Hmm.
of going from there. Like this, but this is why what Labor and I guess people in the Yes camp are also emphasizing is that you can't have treaty before you have the voice to parliament because you need to establish those lines of communication. You need to have the line to uh, the Prime Minister's office in the Australian Parliament before you can actually go into the nitty gritty of sitting down with each mob and saying, let's take a classic example. Go back to the national title issue. So
Yep.
you want to set a treaty of, you know, uh, 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 Crown Land X being part of your sacred community, where your ancestors had lived and died. Um, you know, Before you can establish a treaty of recognizing that of your own sovereignty, you need to have that local and regional voice that can establish, okay, where exactly is that? Where is your connection to the land and all of that, before you can properly sit down with the government and actually talk about that.
Mm.
So that's the reason why massively with this whole thing with the voice of parliament, that they're like, guys, let's get the voice out of the way. Let's get it into the constitution before we start walking down step two and step three.
Mm.
So I guess that's kind of the direction they're going with treaty, but that's the huge thing where they're like, hey, let's put that to the side because let's not count our chickens before they hatch.
Yeah, yeah, right.
Yeah.
Okay. But like let's just like hypothetically take on a situation where you've got you've got the national or the federal government in Australia that dictates yeah, that administers and governs the sovereign nation, which is Australia. And well, actually, I put sovereign in inverted commas because, really, it's still a Commonwealth nation and it's linked very much to the British monarchy, unfortunately. But, let's just say it's a sovereign nation. Now, if you're saying that then within the sovereign nation there are other groups that have like, multiple or numerous mobs that would all lay claim to their own sovereignty. Do you see any type of concern or issue there where you have multiple parties within a one nation all seeking to have separate sovereignty? Or are they still working within an overarching framework, being the Australian federal system, and their sovereignty is just recognized within that, but like one doesn't override the other, or one does sit on top of the other, or is there any type of ranking there, or precedence there? One takes precedence over the other, or like how far has there been thought, or like what's your idea on the idea of having two types of sovereignty acting at the same time?
Well, I'd imagine. Well, let's take that native title example that I was saying before.
Mm,
I think what the expectation would be is that, well, if somebody is looking for sovereignty of their own land, or at least what they consider their sacred land, where
yep,
their family and their mob had lived for generations upon generations. So, like let's say 65,000 BCE, let's say.
yep,
Um, uh, like I think I don't think that doesn't really necessarily um, rocks the boat too much, that you still have a federal or national government that still has that kind of separation of powers, when the indigenous community is just looking for their sacred land just to be recognized under the national government. I don't necessarily see there being an
mm,
issue with that.
right,
If we're talking about whether they want to recede from the federation, and we get a confederacy idea here. I think that's a completely different story. But I'd imagine
but that's what
where
we're
the trick.
talking about potentially when you have two levels of sovereignty or two different types of sovereignty. When you have one group of people that have or claim sovereignty over themselves and over their lands, and you have another group of people that do that. That's the separation potentially of those two people,
Hmm,
because sovereignty, I would think, is exclusive of another type of sovereignty. They wouldn't work together exactly because, like, you can have, like, let's say, land ownership, like you're talking about native
hmm,
title, where you have exclusive land rights over something, but that's held within the framework of that nation
hmm,
kind of thing. So you have different types of title. You have native title and private land holdings are done under Torrens title
yes.
land holdings. So you have those two classes there, but they still work under the national or the federal framework. If you're talking about, or if what's being proposed at some point is that certain land will be under the sovereign nation Australia, and administered by the federal government of Australia, but then other groups have their own sovereignty within their own lands. That's a separation of powers entirely. And so then you'll have people that, if they have their own sovereignty on their own lands, then they have their own rules, laws, and legislation, culture, and all that sort of stuff. Which is like you step over into this area now, you're in
Hmm.
you're in a new nation. ultimately. If we're talking about like sovereignty, like in the maximum kind of thing, like you can have kind of individual sovereignty and stuff like that. But if you're talking about like people reclaiming lands so they can have their sovereignty back or claim to their own sovereignty, then they would have their own laws and rules and regulations. They would be independent, which is, I guess, ultimately what I'm trying to say.
Well, yes, and look, I can't speak for the people that instituted the Uluru Statement of the Heart, and also what the federal government has in store once we get to that
Mm,
stage. But at least when I've heard of such talk about the like native title, or at least reclaiming of their lands, like I've heard a lot of talk about them using it for like traditional purposes, or for them reclaiming their old traditions and that sort of thing.
mm,
But
mm.
whether they're completely 100% independent of Australia as a nation,
Yeah,
like I haven't been hearing the conversation going in
right, right.
that direction. But
Mm.
also I think that might be a reason um, why they've just been focusing on the voice and being like, well, hey, we just want to make this referendum about this because we don't want people um
To get
basically
lost in the hypotheticals.
yes,
Yeah,
which
fair enough, fair enough. But like, I think it's an important question for a revolutionary think tank podcast to
yes.
consider that, like, because I don't know, there might be, but I don't know of other countries that have a system like that, where you have within one nation, multiple groups claiming their own sovereignty. Like they, okay, they might claim it, but like actually being awarded their own sovereignty. There's like a really funny episode of Family Guy that I have seen where Peter isn't on the local land zoning map when he goes to his local council, and ends up establishing, because he's not on the map, he's technically not on American soil, and so he makes his own nation called Pretoria or something like that.
Mm,
It's really funny. He invites like kind of all these I guess you would say enemies of the United States kind of thing, because he feels threatened by the US government, and like Fidel Castro and like all these people are at
yeah.
his pool party. It's hilarious. But like that's the type of picture
Mm,
that I'm painting here, is that if you have people that actually have sovereignty within the larger
mm,
shell that is is a nation kind of thing. There, it opens up some pretty incredible and revolutionary styles of social organization. So,
mm,
which is what revolution is all about at the end of the day. Like a lot of people think it's about the pitchforks and the bloodshed and stuff like that, but really
mm,
revolution is this type of stuff that we're talking about here: constitutional reform or constitutional establishment. So this
mm,
sounds more like a constitutional reform at this stage with the national voice. So you're adding in some clauses here and some steps here and there, and refining slash amending the way things are written. But like changing like who is allowed to be sovereign on certain parts of the land mass, which is
mm,
Australia or the Australian continent. That is revolutionary stuff. Like that's game-changing stuff there for AS.
yeah.
Like absolutely incredible. And then if we go to like this other kind of question that's been put in, I think raised by some people, we've even touched on it so far
Mm,
today, is the idea that you'd have almost, so you have currently in the Australian parliamentary system, you would have the lower house, which makes the
mm,
legislation, and then the upper house that goes and processes and passes the legislation, all that sort of stuff. But you could have a third house in Parliament, which would be one. that speaks for this national voice, or the right, or it's the voice of the First
Mm,
Nations people of Australia.
yeah.
And so if you have people in that are organized with this national voice and the local and the regional voices, and as you said before, they're elected, and they're representing their communities, their mobs that are like across this very
Mm,
vast landscape, then if you had two strings of election, you had election to get into federal parliament as it stands, to either be in the upper or the lower house, but then you also had an
mm.
election for First Nations people and they elected their own people to parliament, and to pass legislation from the lower house, you had to go through two houses, not only the upper house in the federal sense, but then the First Nations house to get legislation to go through it. It had to go through both houses. That's revolutionary in itself. I don't think liberal democracies around the world have like two upper houses that work concurrently.
Well, no, no, no. I can't really think of any. And I guess if we're going into these sort of hypotheticals as well, I know even if you went to the upper house or what they'd like to call the Senate, um, while this would be throwing out a lot of career politicians in the process, as in I wouldn't see them agreeing to this. There's ways of tweaking your political system in order to make things even more egalitarian, or at least
Mm,
more impartial. Like the classical thing I can think of is you establishing a citizens' chamber or a citizens' parliament. And what I
okay.
mean by that is, well, much like you do with any sort of court case. So, like for example, a criminal court case where you have a jury and you basically have lottery system that gets the average person to do a jury service, and sits on the jury. You can fundamentally do exactly the same thing with a Senate or an upper house. What you have is you have a system with everyone that's of voting age. And, similarly, if somebody couldn't do that sitting of parliament, if they had like a decent excuse or anything, they can opt out if they really want to. But effectively, what you have is you have the lottery system, you have like a basic training as to like how the Senate, or at least that chamber, will work. But then you have different people from different walks of life, and you have the career politicians in your lower house, and then you have the ordinary citizens that are in the Senate that are basically looking through it with a fine tooth comb,
Mm,
and they're actually making the final calls on that legislation and being like, oh, well, does this work? Does this work? And who's making the final call in that kind of a citizens' chamber are the ordinary people of that
mm.
nation.
Yeah, which is, I think that's revolutionary in and of
Yeah,
itself,
yeah.
right there. And it's a fantastic suggestion. And I'm glad you brought it up and ran us through that. But like, if what I'm talking about specifically though is that it's like having two groups of people that come together within a nation
Mm,
to make decisions, but they're from decidedly different groups. So what I mean by that is if you are recognized, or you associate with being First Nations, then you would have access to a form of parliament, or like, access to a political system that people that are not First Nations people would not have access to. So like,
right.
you know what I'm saying? I'm saying
Oh,
there's
yeah,
two
yeah.
forms of parliament here. that maybe if they're working concurrently, if they're citizens parliament or they're elected politicians, who cares? I'm talking about basically there's the European system, if we have to call it that,
Right,
which
right,
is what
right.
we have at the moment, the federal kind of state, which is based on the British model. Let's just call that the European political system, and then
Oh,
the First
yeah,
Nations political system. And
yeah.
people that are not of First Nations descent would not be able to be a part of or be elected to or vote in the First Nations form of parliament.
Mm,
And then I guess all other citizens would be voting on and electing people to the other form of parliament. So, like whether that's a
yeah.
citizens' parliament or politicians that are in those two bodies, like whatever. But like you're having two streams of people, and you have a separation between those people to try and give um, two bodies that can enact or make decisions on things, but they have to do it concurrently, let's say.
Yeah, so like okay, let's take the premise of say in a world where um in an alternative world where people heard that this was going to be a third arm of parliament, for example, and
Yep.
everyone was completely on board and
Mm,
went through the referendum, everything happened, happy days. I'm assuming based on what you were kind of talking about there is that what would happen is you have a lower house, so you have a House of Representatives, and they basically table a piece of legislation which details in full what that is.
yep.
Then it would, if it's the European system, it would go to the Senate, do its usual thing. But with this third arm of parliament, if you will,
Hmm.
uh, that would basically be like a second Senate, but it would only be for the sovereign regions of the indigenous population.
Yep.
And basically what they can do is they can be like, oh, hey, we like some of this, but we don't like all of it. What we'll do is we'll take the first bit, we'll rewrite the second bit, and then we'll legislate it in our
Mm.
parliament.
Yeah, in our parliament, or like they take the same legislation, and unless it can pass through both, it never goes anywhere.
So
So you
unless it,
so
so
you
let
have
right,
yeah,
yeah,
so
go
you
for it.
have the European, let's say, model and the First Nations model working side by side, and they both have to agree before anything across the nation can become legislative.
Right. So you're saying
So
that
it's like a
it
cooperative effort, but like it's more stringent or tighter in a way because it's not just passing through a European style of law creation, but it would pass through a house that has decidedly First Nations styles of decision making. But they both have to decide to, let's just say that they're considering legislation on whether we should allow coal mining to happen in Australia anymore.
right, okay,
You'd have
okay.
to have both of those parties say no, or both of those houses to say yes to allow coal mining to happen, or like the parameters around how that would happen and stuff like that.
Right, I can see where you're going with this. So basically instead of having two concurrent parliaments, what you basically have is you're recognizing the indigenous people's sovereignty by saying, okay, you not only do we have the European Senate, European style Senates, but
Yeah.
we also you also have your own
There's
indigenous
a First Nation Senate.
Senate.
And so,
So,
like, instead of dividing the country into different sovereign powers, you recognize that we're all one nation and, we all hold hands and get along. There are some differences, so let's represent them in two different senates.
hmm,
But, like, it must pass through both to be able to get anywhere from now on. So there'll be a joint decision-making process. Gives both sets of people power and level of autonomy, but like it would really change the way that decisions are made in the nation like significantly change the way that things are done in a nation. Because I feel, and this is just on discussions that I've had, I haven't traveled extensively in Australia. I haven't been to Arnhem Land or anything like that. But like what I have understood from people that I've questioned, who have come from remote areas of Australia, from like Indigenous areas of Australia, and all that sort of stuff, is there are two worlds out there. There is the European world, the urbanized world, the industrialized world in Australia, and there is the First Nations world. And
Mm.
don't get me wrong, the two do blend over one another. But like there is a big difference between certain parts of Arnhem Land and like metropolitan Victoria or New South Wales
Mm.
or Brisbane or WA. They are what I'm saying, two different worlds.
Mm.
They're worlds apart, and the people that inhabit them are worlds apart, Indigenous or not, or
Yes.
First Nations or not. And so, like, if you have a separation and a recognition that there are almost two worlds within the land mass that is referred to
Mm.
as Australia, and you represent them, that would give, I guess, some weight to the idea that, you know, you could have two bodies within the nation that make the decisions and try to give them almost equal weight to one another. And that would be a revolutionary way of politically organizing a nation.
Mm.
Like, absolutely, I don't know of any other liberal democracies that would work that way. I just know there's that standard kind of European model, which is like the lower house, the upper house, and like things people get elected to them for terms.
Yeah, the Westminster system.
System, yeah, yeah. But like it's not just the Westminster. I know there's other liberal democracies from other traditions, but they still work like that parliamentary
Mm.
style, like your French system, the Americans and republics. They still have that style of system.
Mm.
They might have some executive power given to a president and stuff like that, but they still have that parliamentary function built into them as just like a core feature. But like regardless, I guess, of all these hypotheticals that we've just been talking about, the idea though that like changing the constitution to allow a national voice, it is by some degree, it's revolutionary in a sense because changing the constitution is almost a revolutionary act in
Mm.
itself.
Well,
Like I said before, it's changing the fabric of the nation in a way. And like if it gets put into practice, then like things won't be the same ever again.
yes, because really, I guess as a final point, for the episode, really, you only have to go across the Tasman, across the pond to, um, our neighbors, the Kiwis, and really when they were establishing their nation, um, the Maoris established a treaty with the white settlers that were coming to them. And look, I don't know their personal situation, but I definitely know in comparison to what the indigenous population here went through, by the Maoris establishing some sort of a treaty with their white settlers. Um, I'm pretty confident they had a much better deal in
Mm,
comparison to, the stolen generations, like everything that happened here in Australia.
mm,
And it's really important to have this first step in that process.
yes, yes. Yeah, look, and that is the aim of the game for a lot of stuff. It's like you got to start here, you got to put one foot in front of the other kind of thing. Um, don't get too far ahead of yourself. And once something is institutionalized, it is put in the constitution, that like yes, that is the one thing that tips the scales, and then the change just starts flowing on from there. But you've got to start off
Mm.
with something that people can grasp, and is not too confronting, um, in order to really start on that movement.
Yes.
So yeah, very interesting discussion. And it's kind of like revolution kind of in action in a sense, as opposed to I guess a lot of the theoretical revolutionary discussion
Mm.
that happens
Yeah.
in the world today. So yeah, look, um, I think we'll leave it there. Good
Yes.
discussion, and I'll put the graphic up when I put this up online and I share it,
Yeah. Yeah.
so you can see the graphic properly because I think it really indicates quite well what we've been talking about. It's not a synthwave art for any of you out there that are wondering.
No, no, I've had to
Yeah,
sacrifice the synthwave art this week, but
yeah,
uh, uh, do trust me that it was for a good cause.
yeah, yeah. All right, well, um, I might start off with our sign off.
Yes.
Thank you everybody for listening. My name is Myster E, and please remember, I am, you are, we are a mystery. Over to you, 4AS.
And remember, everyone, to keep thinking and keep learning. Goodbye till next time.